So what palettes are we going to need in Photoshop? We need our layers palette here. This will come up later on, but you'll be working in your properties palette. You need your toolbar here, of course. And then your channel palette. So if you don't see any of these things, of course, they're always under window, and you can choose these channel layers. And if you don't see your tools, they're down here. Okay? So this one, by default, all these JPEG images are going to be in RGB. I'm just going to turn off all the lights because we need to see the colors. Just try and stay away. One of my grad students told me I had a very soothing voice. I think she meant boring her to tears voice. So it's not funny. Just kidding. So by default, all the images are going to come in as RGB, right? And you can see where the image type is here under Image. And the first one says Mode. And so you can see you can change the grayscale, RGB, CMYK, and LAB. So these are the three that we're going to use here. RGB, CMYK, and LAB. By default, it's RGB. So I'm just going to save as this one. So Command-Shift, save as Hidden Figure, RGB, dryer. Still saving it as a JPEG, but just at maximum quality. It'd be better if these weren't JPEGs, but. So let's just zoom in here a little bit. So you can see, let me change to a different tool. So you can see in here the kind of blue stain. It's hard to see on the screen up there. You kind of, I know there are legs down here, so I can see them, but there is some indication of that. So the first thing you want to do when you're doing this is just open the channel box and click in the different channels and see if the image becomes more apparent. So when you look in the channel box at the top, you've got all three channels combined to give you RGB. But when I just click on the layer for the channel box, it reveals only that channel. So when I look here in R for red, I don't know if you can see a bit, can you see a foot there kind of showing up, a line for the leg here. So there's some information in R. So remember in RGB, when it's a darker color, it's blocking that color. So red is being blocked here. So that means that in the real representation of this, it's slightly blue. So that makes sense. You can see that here. So you can see that. I look in green and I see almost nothing. I see a little bit of the leg here. But if I didn't know this was here, I probably wouldn't see anything. And then in blue, I'm not really seeing very much. So red was the most promising one here so far. So I'll go into red, and now I'm going to adjust the levels of red. So what does adjusting levels mean? Well, if we go in close here, you can see that this image is comprised of pixels, of course, right? And levels indicate how many pixels are of a certain value. So if I go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. So this is the first tool you're going to use, levels, on the different channels. So it gives me a histogram, or a representation of the curve, the number of pixels. So most of our pixels are this mid-gray color here. There are very few that are pure white, actually none that are pure white. The whitest pixel we have is like looks like a 60 or 65% gray. There are, it looks like none that are pure black, or maybe just a few, but there are more that approach black. So you can see the tail end here. And you can see that this is only being applied to the red channel because I had the red channel selected when I did this. So to adjust the levels, and let me just zoom back out so we can see what's going on here. We're just going to pull in the white point, and what this means is pixels that were almost white are going to be represented as white. So now we're getting down here where we're into the data. And so this pixel before that's represented in the histogram used to be about a 65% gray. But now I've pushed the white point in here. We're telling Photoshop to say anything that is that close to white, just represent it as white. So we're heightening the contrast. If I push in too much, then we're going to start to lose data. But I can push in a little bit to see what I can get out of here. So I can see those little feet down here. You can see his legs here a little bit. So that's okay. So I'll just say okay, and you can see it's actually adjusted this red channel. And if I go back to RGB, it's actually changed the color of this image now. So I might go take a look in the blue channel and just see if I can extract anything from there. So with the blue channel selected, go to Layer, go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. And do the same thing. Essentially, you're just pulling in these values, and I'm not seeing anything in here except for these little kind of blue feet. So I'm just going to cancel out of that because it's not doing anything. I can check green, but I don't see anything in green really. See a slight ghost of the figure here. Not a real ghost. But that's no good. So I've done what I can with the channels. So if this was the best I could do, I could either leave the image like this, if this seems like this shows it off the best, or I could actually grab this channel and turn it into a layer. So if I want to do that, if I just select the channel and go to Command A, so that means select all. That's also up here under Select All, Command A. And then copy, you know what copy is, Command C. And then in the layers palette, if I go to add a new layer and then just paste it in there, it just turns that channel into a layer. So it's got its own RGB values itself now. So that's if that's the best you can do. I'm just going to delete that because I think I might be able to get a little bit more out of here. So we've done levels in the channel, so that's the first thing you want to do. Now the next thing you want to do after you've done that is color remapping. So you can see that right now in our RGB representation we've kind of got this bluish stain with this kind of reddish colored stone, but maybe we can heighten the color contrast between these two things. So we're going to use an adjustment layer to do that. So here in the layers palette, again, the resolution's not good and it's slightly off screen. Let me just move it over. You can see this little this circle that's half filled and half unfilled. If I click on that, we can, this is impossible to read, but we can go down and choose one called Hue and Saturation. Okay. And so what you'll see is that it opens up a new layer above our layer. Our background layer, that's the actual photograph. And anything you do to this layer, the effects will be felt on any layer below it. So that's where our Properties tab opens up. So if I select that Hue Saturation layer, now I am going to change my, actually I'm not going to change my resolution because it'll cancel my screen recording. So let me just tell you, you can sort of see that this says Hue, this says Saturation, and this says Lightness. So for color remapping, we're going to false color the image by boosting the saturation. So turning up saturation, you can see what's happening to the image. And again, it's hard to see on this screen, but it's already showing me the legs a little more strongly here, the contrast between this reddish color and this bluish color. But I can also adjust the lightness to see if that helps. It often doesn't, it just kind of washes out the image. But sometimes you want to turn down the lightness to heighten the saturation a bit. But then what's more important is the hue scaling, or the color remapping. So just look here for a second, and this bar of color is the original color. This bar of color is the remapped color. So right now they line up perfectly. So what was red is red, what was yellow is yellow. But if I start doing a hue shift, you'll see those bars shift. So now you can see what used to be yellow is now greenish, what used to be green is now bluish. So you can shift this around looking at the image and see if you can pick out our figure any better. So now when I get into this color remap, where I've got this kind of purple against the blue, I'm starting to see the legs more strongly. You can see his vest kind of here, whatever that is, and his arms a little bit. You can keep moving around here till you can find the best image. I should do it on my screen. So it's often the color contrast where you're going across the A and B where you'll see this. So this kind of contrast between this yellowish green and blue works pretty well. Between the warm and cool colors can work well. So let's say I decide this is the best I can do. I can either just leave it like this, or if I want to, I can select these two layers and merge them just to freeze it in this position. And the reason for that is then we can look at the channels again. So to merge layers, you select two layers and just hit Command E. And now it just turns it into one false colored image without access to that hue and saturation shift anymore. So you want to make sure you got to the position where you're happy with things. And then this is the iterative process. We can now go back in and look at the channels again and see if things show up better in the channels now. So in the red box, when it's turned to just the grayscale value, I can see his legs a little more. Now all of a sudden he shows up pretty nicely in green, right? Because of the way we've color remapped it. And I'm not really seeing anything here. So I'd say in this case, the green is giving me the best image. So I can do the same thing. I can Command A to select all. Did it select all? Yeah. Copy, and then go back into my layers palette, create a new layer, and just paste it in there. So now you can actually see him pretty well, right? And so you can do different things now and just experiment. You might want to invert the image. To invert the image is Command I. See if that helps, and that's pretty good. I think in the instructions I talk about experimenting with different blend modes. So blend modes in the layer palette indicate how one layer is combined with the layer below. And so you can try this to see if it gives you anything good using something like overlay. Doesn't help. Lighten. So lighten kind of combines some of that information, but I don't think it gives us anything better than just normal. You can try multiply. And now I could even, if I wanted to, on this layer rather than this channel, I could adjust its levels to see if I can heighten this a little bit. So I can go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and pull this in. And then he starts to get revealed pretty nicely. And you can see details like eyebrows, the eyes with the iris or pupils, the nose, it looks like his tongue is sticking out. He's wearing a vest. He's got feet and everything. And so if I got to that point, I would say okay, and I would save this as my RGB image. So I want to get the best image I can out of this. I'm going to do this 2 more times, so all these different steps you're going to see, okay? Are there any questions so far? No. Okay, I'm going to save this. This is my RGB, so I'll just do save it as a Photoshop document, so that will preserve the layers, if there are any. And now I'm going to open up the original image again. And this time I'm going to switch it to a different color mode. So that's under Image, Mode, and this time I'll choose CMYK. So if you look right now before I switch that, my channel palette is there. You can see it's still RGB, red, green, and blue. As soon as I switch it to CMYK, it will say some stuff and you just say OK. Now my color palette, or my channel palette, has cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So So again, I'm going to sort of interrogate these to see where the image shows up, and all of a sudden in cyan, without even any adjustments, you can see he's separated out pretty nicely. I can see his eyes, his vest, his feet, his arms there. So let's check out magenta, nothing. Yellow, nothing. Black, nothing. So cyan is our path to victory here, I think. So do the same thing. Select the channel, image, adjustments, and do a levels adjustment. Pull in the white and black values to exaggerate the contrast in this layer. So that's pretty good. So here again I might decide to go select all, copy, and paste this into a new layer in the layers palette. Now I just want to show you something, because this will happen all the time. It'll be slightly confusing. So I've put this channel, I've turned it into a layer now. So before, when it was a channel, it was a representation of how much cyan was being let through. Now it's actually a layer, so it's got its own CMYK channels. So when I have this layer selected in the layers palette, you can see it's got its own channels in C, M, Y, and K. But if I select the background layer, it goes back to the original. Or no, it has both of them until I turn off the visibility of one, sorry. So if I turn off the visibility of this top layer, then it goes back to just the background image. So these channels will change if you put things into new layers. So I'm not going to put it into a new layer yet, but just to show you. I'm going to do my color remapping now that I've adjusted the levels. So again, in the layers palette, go to hue and saturation in the adjustment layers. And in my properties tab, I can make some changes. So again, I'm going to hypersaturate the image, and all of a sudden it's popping out more already, at least on my screen it is. If you saturate too much, you start to get a lot of noise, so it's usually a little less than pure saturation, but you can adjust this and play around with it. And then just do the color remapping. And so here, when I get into this territory where yellow is being remapped to green, again, at least on my screen, I can see this a little more clearly. I can move around and just try and find the best representation. So here in an area like this, where you've got blue against this magenta kind of color, you don't see much at all. But when you do sort of more of a contrast, I can see the character coming forward. But for me, I think this is the best one. Something like this. So again, I'm going to, in my layers palette, I'm going to merge these two layers when I'm happy with this, selecting both layers, Command E. And then in my channels palette, I'll take a look and see if there's anything more apparent. So there in the cyan channel, he's coming up pretty clearly. Now in magenta 2 and in yellow. So I could pick among these, or I could combine them. There's nothing in the black channel. So this is pretty good, cyan, so select all, copy this, and then make a new layer here and paste that. So you only have to do this if you think the black and white image is the best representation. If you think it shows up best here, then you can show that. A lot of the time it's the black and white image that will show it the best. So copying out a channel and pasting it in the layers palette is often the best way to go. But you can then turn that off and look at the hypersaturated one below. And then if I want to, in the layers palette, I can adjust the levels to see if I can heighten this. So we're really kind of destroying this image, we're adding a lot of noise in here. But when I do that, I'm kind of wrecking it a little bit. I think it's better just as it is. So there's just some judgment here, so I want to see you thinking about it and trying to decide what you think is best. So one thing I forgot to do, I should have saved as this with the name CMYK. And then I would go on and do the final one. Let me just do that very quickly. Start again from the original. I'm going to convert this image mode to LAB. So you can see the channel palette changes. So under lightness, we're not seeing much. I'm seeing a little bit of the paint there. But then when I look in A, it's this weird, just vague grayscale image. And then B, you can see the character in there a little bit. So let's adjust A. The shortcut for levels is Command L. I can pull in these values. And there he kind of pops out pretty clearly in the A channel. So that's good. So I can do the same thing in the B channel. Command L. Can pull in the values here. That's pretty good too. Oh, looks like he has a tail in this one. Or something. Maybe not a tail, I don't know. So now we've got two channels that show it off pretty well. If you look down here sort of at his pelvis, I don't know, there's something we can see there in the images I don't think we could see before. So now our colored image is bizarrely colored, but we can do a hue saturation shift again, just to see if we can pick out more detail. And you might find that this ruins your channels, and you might want to get rid of this. So again, it's up to you to decide. So we're going to hypersaturate this. It's already so saturated, we're not seeing much of a difference. And the reason for that is because, remember, A and B are the only ones that contain color information. So by pulling in their levels, we're sort of saturating it already. Then we can move this around until we can find a good contrast. Again, on my screen, this shows up pretty well. Up there, not so much. Now I've got a really good contrast here. You can see. And that's a pretty good contrast here too between the green and the magenta. So I'm going to stop there. And then I'm just going to try and combine these. I might undo out of this. So I'm going to merge these two layers, Command E, then go back into the channel box. And see, lightness hasn't been changed at all because we're only acting on the color channels here by switching saturation and hue. Lightness is just value, so it doesn't change at all. But here we get sort of a hyper. Now all of a sudden we've lost it totally in B. So I don't know, I kind of think it was better before I did all that. So I'm just going to undo out of that and get rid of this layer. Yeah, this looks clearer to me. So I'm just going to take A, which looks like the best one. Command, I'm going to delete this hue saturation layer. And go back into the A channel, Command A, copy, create a new layer, paste it in. And we've got a pretty good representation of this person here. And I might try to adjust the levels again on the layer rather than the channel, just to see if I can heighten it. So you can see the histogram starts to look really weird. It's banded because of the way we were adjusting the saturation before. But we can see if we can pick out any more detail here. But we're just actually degrading the image perhaps too much at this point because we're throwing away a lot of data. So in this case, I would say no, this is probably the best. I could try to invert it. That's just reversing it. Sometimes it's easier to see. So I'd be happy with that. So I would save as my LAB. So you can see it's just a repetitive sort of pattern, opening the image, changing to the color mode you want, examining the channels, adjusting the levels of those channels, doing the chroma shift, and then making some decisions about what gives you the best image, whether it's copying out a channel and pasting it into the layers palette, leaving it as the chroma shift. I want you to try and figure that out. Any questions? Yeah?
How do we combine
The two layers?
yeah.
So when you have two layers, I'll just do it with this one. This is a different kind of layer, but so if you select both of them, so hold down Shift, so they're both highlighted in blue here. You can either go to Layer and Merge Layers, or you can just hit Command E, and that will merge them together. Yep.
So what's the difference between like changing the color mode before you do the editing compared to like you already finished and you get a particular image and you change the color mode last? Like is there a difference?
Like to LAB and RGB?
Yeah.
Well, because when you get a pretty good image, if it's in RGB, you're using those channels, right?
Yeah.
If you switch to the other color mode first, then you're examining different channels first. So when you change from RGB to CMYK, it allows that it separates the image differently into CM, Y, and K rather than RGB. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but so
Let me just show again, just quickly. So if I just open up, I'll open up a different image, maybe which one? The spray paint. So if we look here in spray paint, and we're by default in RGB, right? So if I click on R, can you guys just keep it down for a sec? So we click on R, we're not really seeing anything in the background. Click on blue, not really seeing anything, or sorry, on green. Click on blue, and it's hard to see on that screen. You might be able to see a bit of that skirt shape here. So this is separated at that paint color because there's some blue in it. But if I don't do anything now, and if I just go to different layer mode, so image mode, I'll switch to CMYK. Now the image doesn't change at all, just the way it's separated out into different channels changes. So now if I look here in cyan, I'm not seeing anything. Magenta, not really seeing anything. Now all of a sudden in yellow, the character kind of pops forward because if you look at the original image, she was kind of painted in yellow. And so this color mode separates colors maybe in a more useful way to us. So by changing it at the beginning, it just gives us access to different color separation. Okay. So at the end of this course, you're giving me all your exercises, remember? So for this one, you're giving me 12 images, 12 PSD files. 3 for each of the 4 samples. 1 in RGB, 1 in LAB, 1 in CMYK. Yeah?
you want them in Photoshop files?
Yeah, just save them in Photoshop files because that way I can see if you have layers you want me to look at or something like that. Okay? So, okay, it took me a little longer than I thought. So we've got about an hour and 10 minutes to work on it. And next week we'll be devoting, I'm not sure what I'm going to talk about next week, but we'll be devoting most of the class to working on the project, or you could use time to work on this stuff too. Okay? Great.